The rain hammered the cracked pavement like bullets, each drop exploding into silver mist under the broken streetlights. Kenny Cross pulled his black overcoat tighter, the fabric soaked through but still carrying the weight of authority he'd worn for 20 years. His driver waited 3 blocks back, engine idling, headlights dark. This part of the city belonged to questions nobody asked and answers nobody wanted. Kenny had built it that way, brick by brick, deal by deal, until the night itself learned to keep his secrets. He moved through the industrial district like a shadow with purpose, his shoes finding puddles that reflected nothing but empty sky. The warehouses loomed silent, their windows long shattered, their loading docks rusted into stillness. This was where the city forgot itself, where good people didn't wander and bad people came to settle accounts. Kenny checked his watch, the gold face catching what little light existed. The meet was in 10 minutes, a negotiation over territory lines that had been blurred by ambition and stupidity. He didn't expect trouble, but expectation was how men ended up bleeding in places like this. His hand brushed the gun beneath his coat, a reassurance he'd carried so long it felt like bone. The sound reached him before the sight. Metal grinding against asphalt, the hiss of a radiator dying, the low whine of an engine that knew it was finished. Kenny stopped mid-stride, instinct sharpening every sense he possessed. The crash wasn't fresh, maybe 5 minutes, maybe 10, but the smoke still rose thick and chemical into the rain. He turned toward it, footsteps careful, breathing measured. Men in his position didn't investigate accidents. They walked past them, let the world clean up its own messes, stayed uninvolved and unwitnessed. But something pulled him forward, a gravity he couldn't name, the kind of pull that rewrote plans and changed trajectories. He rounded the corner of a collapsed loading bay and saw the car. It had hit the concrete barrier at an angle, the front end crumpled like paper, glass scattered in a constellation of sharp stars. The driver's door hung open, creaking on a broken hinge. Smoke poured from under the hood, not flames yet, but the promise of them. Kenny approached slowly, his eyes scanning for movement, for threat, for the trap this could easily be. The rain soaked everything, turning blood into watercolor streaks on the pavement. She was slumped against the steering wheel, her body twisted in a way that spoke of impact and surrender. Kenny saw the uniform first, dark blue turned black by rain and blood, the badge still pinned but reflecting nothing. A cop. His jaw tightened, every instinct screaming to walk away, to vanish into the night before this became his problem. Cops meant questions, meant investigations, meant spotlights on corners of his life that thrived in darkness. He took a step back, then stopped. Her hand moved, just barely, fingers twitching against the wheel, like she was trying to hold on to something slipping away. Kenny cursed under his breath, the words lost in the rain's percussion. He moved to the car door, glass crunching under his weight. Up close, he could see the wound, a gash along her side where metal had torn through fabric and flesh. The blood came steady but not spurting, bad but maybe not fatal if someone acted fast. Her eyes fluttered, unfocused, pupils trying to find purchase in a world going dark. She was young, maybe 30, her face pale beneath the grime and rain. A nameplate read Carter in simple block letters. "Can you hear me?" Kenny's voice cut through the storm, low and steady, the same tone he used when deals went sideways and panic was the enemy. Her lips moved, forming words without sound, her breath coming in shallow gasps that fogged in the cold. Kenny assessed the situation with the cold efficiency that had kept him alive in a business where mistakes were measured in body bags. The car was dying, smoke thickening, the engine's heat building toward something critical. He couldn't wait for sirens, couldn't hope for help to arrive in time. This neighborhood didn't get fast responses, didn't rate high on the city's list of priorities. He looked at her again, at the way her hand still gripped the wheel like it was the only solid thing in a world tilting sideways. He thought about walking away, about the dozen ways this could destroy everything he'd built. Then he thought about the weight of choices, about the lines men drew and the moments that redrew them. He reached into the car, his hands finding her shoulders, her pulse weak against his fingers. "Stay with me," he said, the command simple and absolute. "Don't you quit." Getting her out took strength and care in measures Kenny hadn't needed to balance in years. He slid one arm behind her shoulders, the other beneath her knees, lifting her weight as gently as violence allowed. She groaned, the sound catching in her throat, her head lolling against his chest. The badge pressed cold through his coat. Kenny carried her away from the car, his steps sure despite the rain-slicked ground, his breathing controlled despite the burden. He laid her on the concrete 20 feet from the wreck, his coat coming off to pillow her head, his hands already moving to the wound. The blood soaked through his shirt, warm and insistent, a clock ticking in red. He tore fabric, making a compress, applying pressure with the certainty of someone who'd seen trauma before and knew the difference between panic and precision. Her eyes opened, really opened, focusing on his face with an intensity that cut through the shock. "Who?" she whispered, the question incomplete but understood. Kenny met her gaze, rain dripping from his hair, his hands steady on her wound. "Someone who's here," he said, offering no name, no history, nothing but presence. She studied him through the haze of pain, and something in her expression shifted. Recognition maybe, or suspicion, or just the animal understanding that this stranger was the difference between living and dying. Behind them, the car's engine gave a final metallic shriek, and flames began to lick from beneath the hood, orange light dancing across the rain-soaked industrial wasteland. Kenny didn't flinch, didn't turn. His attention locked on keeping pressure, on keeping her conscious, on keeping death at arm's length for another minute, another breath. Her hand found his wrist, gripping with surprising strength, her voice stronger now. "Radio," she managed, the word costing her. Kenny glanced at the burning car, at the distance that felt like miles, at the risk that felt like suicide. But he saw what she was telling him, saw the lifeline she couldn't reach. He looked down at her, at the trust and desperation mixing in her eyes. "Don't move," he ordered, his voice carrying the weight of command that made men obey without question. He stood, his hands leaving her wound for the seconds it would take, his body already moving toward the flames. The heat hit him 3 feet from the wreck, the smoke acrid and choking. Kenny pulled his sleeve over his hand, reached through the broken window, and grabbed the radio handset. The cord stretched, then snapped free. He was back beside her in seconds, pressing the compress back into place with one hand while keying the radio with the other. Static crackled, then cleared. Kenny pressed the button, his voice stripped of accent and effect, neutral as concrete. "Officer down, Industrial District, north end of Riverside, near the old textile mill. Gunshot wound to the side, conscious but critical. Send ambulance now." He released the button. The voice that answered came fast and sharp, dispatcher training cutting through shock. "Identify yourself. Who is this? What's your badge number?" Kenny looked at the woman beneath his hands, at the way she watched him with eyes that knew things, that had seen things, that recognized the shape of danger even when it wore the face of salvation. He brought the radio to his lips again. "Just send help," he said, then dropped the handset into the pooling water. The flames from the car climbed higher now, casting wild shadows that made the whole scene look like something from a fever dream. Unreal and too real all at once. Kenny kept pressure on the wound, his other hand finding her wrist, checking the pulse that fluttered like something caged and desperate. "What's your name?" she asked, the question intimate in its simplicity. Kenny shook his head slowly. "Doesn't matter." She almost smiled, the expression ghosting across her face before pain stole it back. Matters to me. He studied her, this cop bleeding under his hands, this woman who'd stumbled into his path and changed the trajectory of his carefully ordered night. Then ask me when you're not dying, he said, the words somewhere between promise and deflection. The sirens came sooner than Kenny expected, their wail cutting through the rain's white noise, growing louder with each second. Red and blue lights began to strobe against the warehouse walls, painting everything in alternating shades of emergency. Kenny's jaw tightened. This was the moment. The point where his presence shifted from mysterious to suspicious, where questions became interrogations, where a man like him couldn't afford to be found. He looked down at her, at the color slowly returning to her face, at the way her breathing had steadied under his care. She looked back, understanding flickering in her eyes even through the shock. "You should go," she said, the words quiet but clear. Kenny nodded once, his hands lifting from her wound slowly, reluctantly, making sure the pressure held. He stood, his shirt and hands dark with her blood, his coat still pillowing her head. The sirens were 2 blocks away now, maybe less, the lights visible through the rain. He took a step back, then another, putting distance between himself and the scene, between his world and hers. "Thank you," she called after him, her voice carrying despite its weakness. Kenny stopped, his back to her, his face tilted toward the night that was his home and his prison. He didn't turn, didn't acknowledge, just let the words settle somewhere he'd examine later. Then he was moving, his stride long and purposeful, his form melting into the shadows between buildings as naturally as smoke rising. The squad cars arrived in a chaos of noise and light, officers pouring out with weapons drawn and questions shouted. They found her alone, conscious, bleeding, her story already forming in her mind. She told them about the crash, about the wound, about the stranger who'd appeared from nowhere and kept her alive. They pressed for details, for descriptions, for anything concrete. She gave them enough to satisfy the immediate need, but not enough to build a case. "Tall," she said. "Dark coat. Didn't give a name." The officers exchanged glances, that look cops shared when something didn't add up, but the math was too dangerous to solve. The ambulance took her, sirens wailing back through the rain, toward hospitals and questions and reports. As they loaded her stretcher, she turned her head, looking back at the industrial district, at the shadows that held secrets and the night that kept them. Somewhere out there, a man was walking back to his car, his driver asking no questions, his world continuing its rotation as if nothing had changed. But she'd seen his face, memorized the lines and angles, cataloged the details the way cops were trained to catalog. And in the deepest place where instinct lived, she knew their paths weren't finished crossing. That rescue was just the first verse of a longer song. Kenny reached his car 3 blocks away, his clothes soaked and blood-stained, his hands still shaking with adrenaline he refused to acknowledge. His driver, Marcus, took one look and said nothing. Just pulled into traffic with the smooth competence of a man who'd learned when silence was survival. Kenny stared out the window, watching the city slide past in streaks of neon and rain, his mind replaying the last 30 minutes in obsessive detail. He'd broken his own rules, the cardinal ones, the laws that kept men like him breathing free. Never get involved, never leave evidence, never let emotion override calculation. He'd shattered all 3 for a woman whose name he barely knew, whose face he'd probably see in nightmares or daydreams. He wasn't sure which. Marcus cleared his throat carefully. "The meet?" Kenny shook his head. "Reschedule, tell them something came up." Marcus nodded, his eyes finding Kenny's in the rearview mirror, a question there that wouldn't be asked aloud. Kenny looked away first, his attention returning to the city that sprawled beneath them, indifferent and hungry, always hungry. Somewhere in that grid of light and shadow, a cop named Carter was being stitched back together, her blood mixing with hospital antiseptic, her mind probably trying to make sense of charity from darkness. Kenny wondered if she'd pursue it, if duty would override gratitude, if their next meeting would be across an interrogation table instead of a rain-soaked street. The weeks that followed moved with the strange elastic quality of time when waiting became a third presence in every room. Kenny ran his operations with the same precision that had built his empire, the meetings and decisions flowing in their usual patterns. But something had shifted in the foundation, a crack too subtle to measure but impossible to ignore. He found himself scanning police reports in ways he never had before, not for threats to his business but for mentions of a recovered officer, for updates on a case that might be forming around him. His people brought news that the crash investigation had been ruled an accident, mechanical failure combined with bad weather, no foul play suspected. The officer had been released after 10 days, her statement on file, her description of her rescuer vague enough to be useless. Kenny should have felt relief. Instead, he felt something closer to disappointment. He caught himself driving past the hospital at odd hours, never stopping, never slowing enough to be noticed, just marking the location like a hunter noting water holes. Marcus asked no questions, but his silence had texture now. Weight. The kind that spoke volumes without needing words. On a Tuesday that felt like any other, Kenny sat in his usual booth at the back of a restaurant he owned, reviewing numbers that determined livelihoods and futures. The lunch crowd moved in predictable patterns, businessmen and lawyers and people who wore respectability like armor while dining in an establishment that laundered money as efficiently as it served pasta. That's when she walked in. Kenny's eyes found her immediately, that radar he'd developed for threats and opportunities pinging hard. She wore civilian clothes, jeans and a leather jacket, but she moved like a cop. That particular awareness that came from years of scanning rooms for danger. Her side still showed stiffness, the way she favored her left when she walked, evidence of healing that hadn't quite finished. She spotted him just as quickly, their eyes meeting across 30 feet and a lifetime of different choices. For a moment, neither moved, the restaurant continuing its business around them while something else played out in the space between tables. Then she walked toward him, her stride deliberate, her face unreadable. Kenny's security detail shifted, hands moving toward weapons, bodies tensing for intervention. Kenny raised one hand slightly, a gesture that meant stand down. That meant, let this happen. That meant he'd made a choice that superseded protocol. She reached his table and stood there, looking down at him with eyes that had seen his face covered in her blood, that had memorized the shape of salvation in the dark. "Mr. Cross," she said, her voice steady, using the name she must have spent weeks hunting. Kenny gestured to the seat across from him, an invitation that felt like stepping off a cliff. "Officer Carter?" She sat, wincing slightly, her hand unconsciously going to her side. "Not on duty," she clarified. "Just visiting." The silence that followed had teeth. Kenny studied her openly now, in the light and calm, seeing details the rain and emergency had obscured. She was stronger than she'd looked dying, her jaw set in a way that spoke of decisions made and owned, her eyes carrying the kind of intelligence that missed nothing and forgot less. She studied him right back, and Kenny knew she was cataloging, building a file in her mind, adding to whatever investigation she'd already conducted. "I wanted to thank you," she said finally, the words simple but carrying complicated weight. "Properly. Not bleeding out in an industrial wasteland." Kenny leaned back, his posture relaxed but his mind calculating angles and consequences. "You already did. That night." She shook her head slightly. "I was in shock. I barely remember what I said." But I remember what you did. You saved my life. Kenny picked up his water glass, buying time, his reflection distorted in the crystal. Anyone would have done the same. She smiled then, the expression sharp enough to cut. We both know that's not true, and we both know who you are, what you are. The words hung between them, accusation and acknowledgement braided together. Kenny met her eyes, his face giving nothing away. If you came here to arrest me, you'd have brought backup. She nodded slowly. I didn't come here to arrest you. I came here because I owe you my life, and I don't know what to do with that. The honesty of it landed like a punch, unexpected and effective. Kenny had been prepared for threats, for wires, for the careful dance of law enforcement trying to flip a witness or build a case. He hadn't been prepared for simple, complicated truth. You don't owe me anything, he said, meaning it and not meaning it simultaneously. The debt was paid the moment you pulled me out of that car. She leaned forward slightly, her elbows on the table, her intensity focused like a laser. I've spent 3 weeks trying to square what happened, trying to figure out why a man with your reputation would risk everything to save a cop. My captain thinks you were there for something else, that you're playing an angle. My partner thinks I'm crazy for not pushing for a full investigation. Kenny raised an eyebrow. What do you think? She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming once against the table, a tell of nerves beneath the control. I think you made a choice in the rain that didn't make sense according to the rules we both live by. I think it cost you something I can't measure. And I think it means something, even if I don't know what yet. Kenny felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of tension he hadn't realized he was carrying. Sometimes choices don't make sense until later, he said quietly. Sometimes they never do. A waiter approached, professional and oblivious, asking if the lady wanted anything. She ordered coffee, black, her eyes never leaving Kenny's face. When the waiter left, she leaned back, the posture opening slightly, the cop mask lowering just enough to show the person underneath. I'm not here to complicate your life, she said. I know what that could mean for both of us, but I needed you to know that what you did mattered, that it changed something. Kenny nodded slowly, accepting the words and the weight they carried. And now? She smiled again, this time with less edge and more genuine warmth. Now I go back to my life, and you go back to yours. But if you ever need something, if there's ever a moment where the balance tips, you know where to find me. It was an offer and a warning, a door left unlocked and a boundary drawn simultaneously. Kenny understood both meanings, appreciated the complexity of the woman sitting across from him who could hold contradictions without breaking. Be careful with offers like that, he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. They have a way of coming due when you least expect it. She stood, her movement careful but stronger than when she'd walked in, healing happening in real time. Then I guess we'll both have to be ready. She held out her hand, and after a moment Kenny took it, the handshake firm and lingering, a connection that acknowledged something neither would name. Then she was walking away, her stride carrying her back toward the door, back toward the life that existed on the opposite side of every line Kenny had drawn. The restaurant returned to normal, the moment passing into memory, but Kenny sat still, his coffee cooling, his mind working through implications and possibilities. Marcus appeared at his elbow, his voice low. Problem? Kenny shook his head. No, not a problem. Marcus waited. The silence, asking for more. Kenny looked at the door where she'd exited, at the space where choices echoed. Maybe the opposite, he said finally, the words surprising him as much as they would surprise Marcus. He stood, leaving money on the table, more than necessary, a habit of his that spoke to old superstitions and older guilts. As he walked out into the afternoon light, the city stretched before him in all its contradictions, beautiful and brutal, offering and demanding simultaneously. Somewhere out there, a cop was driving back to a precinct, writing a mental report that would never be filed, carrying a debt that couldn't be repaid and a truth that couldn't be spoken. And somewhere in the space between his world and hers, a thread had been woven, invisible but strong, connecting two people who should have remained strangers forever. Kenny didn't know what would come of it, didn't trust hope enough to imagine futures. But he knew the city well enough to understand that threads like that didn't break easily, that rescue was a door that swung both ways, that the rain-soaked night where he'd made an impossible choice was just the beginning of something he couldn't yet name. The months moved forward with the inevitability of seasons, summer bleeding into fall, the city's temperature dropping while its temperature rose in other ways. Kenny's business continued its complex dance with law and chaos, territories negotiated, disputes settled, money flowing through channels legitimate and otherwise. He thought about the cop less often as time created distance, but she lived in the corner of his mind like an unsolved equation, present whether he acknowledged her or not. Then the phone call came, late on a Wednesday, when November had turned mean. Marcus handed him the cell with an expression that meant trouble, the kind without easy solutions. Kenny took it, his voice steady. Cross. The voice on the other end was familiar despite the months of silence, carrying strain but still strong. I'm calling in that offer. Kenny sat up straighter, his focus sharpening. Carter. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. I have a situation. My sister. She witnessed something she shouldn't have, and now there are people looking for her who won't stop until she can't testify. Official channels aren't working fast enough, and the threats are escalating. I need her safe while I build a case that'll stick. Kenny processed the information, his mind already running scenarios. You're asking me to hide a civilian witness? Her laugh was short and bitter. I'm asking the man who saved my life to help me save hers. I know what I'm asking. I know what it means. But I'm out of options. And you said the debt might come due. Kenny looked out his window at the city lights spread below him like a circuit board of choices and consequences. He thought about lines crossed and lines held, about the difference between the man he'd been and the man he was becoming, about the price of every decision. Where is she now? Relief flooded Carter's voice, audible even through the digital compression. Safe house, but it's compromised. They'll move on it within 48 hours. Kenny checked his watch, already calculating logistics. I'll send a car. One of my places, off the grid, the kind of safe that doesn't appear on any map. Carter was quiet for a moment, and Kenny could hear the sound of her weighing costs and benefits, of accepting help from a source that complicated everything. This doesn't make us even, she said finally. I know what I'm asking you to risk. Kenny smiled without humor. Nothing about what we're doing is even, but maybe that's not the point. He gave her an address, a time, instructions for her sister that balanced security with necessity. When he hung up, Marcus was already waiting with the question in his eyes. Kenny stood, his decision made and owned. We're putting someone in the safe house. Full protection, no questions, no exposure. Marcus nodded, processing implications. Cop's family? Kenny met his eyes. The cop who didn't ask questions 3 months ago when she could have. Understanding flickered across Marcus's face, that recognition of debts that transcended business. How long? Kenny shook his head. However long it takes. The machinery of protection moved with practiced efficiency, Kenny's people executing plans they'd rehearsed for their own safety, and now deployed for a stranger connected by threads of gratitude and obligation. The sister arrived at midnight, scared and trying not to show it. Carter beside her with the protective stance of someone who'd already lost too much. Kenny met them himself, against protocol, against sense, but owing to something that felt like honor in a life that had long ago abandoned the concept. The sister was younger, early 20s, her eyes wide with the kind of fear that came from understanding how small safety really was. Carter introduced her quietly. "This is Grace, my little sister." Kenny nodded, his voice gentle in a way few people heard. "You'll be safe here. My word on it." Grace looked at him, then at Carter, questions in her eyes that Carter answered with a nod. The trust there, implicit and complete, was its own kind of weapon. Kenny showed them the space himself, a converted loft in a building he owned through enough corporate shells to make tracking impossible. The security was subtle but absolute. Cameras in patterns designed by paranoia and experience, exits multiple and maintained, protocol established for scenarios ranging from raids to fires. Carter took it all in, her professional eye assessing and approving. When Grace was settled in the bedroom, exhaustion claiming her before fear could, Carter and Kenny stood in the kitchen area, the silence between them different than their first meeting. "Thank you," Carter said, and this time the words carried weight of different depth. Gratitude mixed with the cost of accepting help from the wrong side of righteousness. Kenny poured coffee from a pot he'd made, anticipating the long night, the domestic gesture strange in the context of criminality and protection. "Tell me what we're dealing with." Carter laid it out, the case details clinical and damning. Grace had been working at a legal firm, junior position, someone invisible enough to be present when powerful men made stupid assumptions about discretion. She'd overheard details of a money laundering scheme that connected to something bigger, darker, more dangerous. When she'd tried to report it through channels, the channels had leaked, and suddenly she was a target instead of a witness. Carter had been fighting through bureaucracy and politics, trying to build a case that would protect her sister and bring down the guilty simultaneously. But the machine moved slow, and the threat moved fast, and here they were in a criminal's safe house, trusting the man the law was supposed to oppose. Kenny listened with the attention he gave high-stakes negotiations, asking questions that revealed understanding of how systems worked and failed. When Carter finished, he leaned against the counter, his expression thoughtful. "The people coming for her, they're not going to stop because you asked nicely. They're going to push until something breaks." Carter nodded, her jaw tight. "I know. That's why I'm here." Kenny met her eyes, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of the impossible position they'd created. "I'll keep her safe. But Carter, you need to understand what that might mean. If they push hard enough, I'll push back. And my methods won't look good in a courtroom." Carter held his gaze and he saw the war happening behind her eyes, duty against debt, law against life. Finally, she nodded. "Do what you have to do. Just keep her breathing." It was permission and confession, the cop crossing a line that had always existed in theory but now stood real and unavoidable. Kenny accepted it with the gravity it deserved, the weight of trust that came from the most unlikely source. Days became weeks, Grace living in careful isolation while Carter worked the case from her side and Kenny maintained security from his. They developed a rhythm, unlikely partners in an impossible situation, their worlds overlapping in ways neither had anticipated. Carter came by 3 or 4 times a week, checking on Grace, updating Kenny on case progress, their conversations growing longer and less guarded. Kenny found himself looking forward to those visits in ways that had nothing to do with security briefings. They talked about Grace's well-being, but also about their lives, careful revelations that built understanding brick by cautious brick. Carter told him about growing up with Grace, raising her after their parents died, the weight of being both sister and guardian, the reason she'd become a cop in the first place, protection codified into career. Kenny told her about his own path, the choices that seemed inevitable at the time, the accumulation of decisions that built the cage he now lived in. Neither excused, neither judged, they just existed in the space of honesty that felt revolutionary. Grace became the bridge between them, her presence the excuse for connection that went deeper than protection details. She warmed to Kenny in ways that surprised them all, seeing past reputation to the man who kept his word, who ensured she had books and decent food, and didn't treat her like cargo. One evening, while Carter was delayed at the precinct, Grace and Kenny played cards, her competitive streak emerging from beneath the fear. "You're not what I expected," Grace said, laying down a winning hand with satisfaction. Kenny smiled, collecting the cards for another deal. "What did you expect?" She considered, her young face serious. "Someone scarier. Someone who wouldn't know how to shuffle cards without it feeling like a threat." Kenny dealt, his movements practiced and smooth. Fear is a tool, but it's not the only one, and it's rarely the best one. Grace picked up her hand, arranging cards with the focus of someone grateful for normal moments. "My sister's scared of you, not physically, but scared of what it means that she trusts you." Kenny nodded, understanding the distinction. "Smart. Trust is dangerous when it crosses the lines we've drawn." Grace looked at him with eyes older than her years. "Maybe the lines are the dangerous part. Maybe people are just people, making choices." It was wisdom from someone who'd seen boundaries dissolve, who'd learned that safety came from unexpected places and threat wore familiar faces. Kenny felt something shift in his chest, the observation landing somewhere that mattered. When Carter arrived later, windblown and tired, she found them mid-game, Grace laughing at something Kenny said, the scene domestic in a way that should have been impossible. Carter stopped in the doorway, taking it in, and Kenny saw the conflict play across her face, relief and worry braided together. Later, after Grace had gone to bed, Carter and Kenny stood on the small balcony, the city spread below them in glittering indifference. "She likes you," Carter said, the statement carrying question marks. Kenny leaned against the railing, the metal cold through his shirt. "She's good people. She'll be okay when this is over." Carter was quiet, and when she spoke, her voice carried vulnerability he hadn't heard before. "What if I don't want it to be over? Not the danger that I want gone, but this, whatever this is." Kenny turned to look at her, the city lights catching in her eyes, making them shine like something precious and fragile. "This is complicated in ways neither of us can afford." She nodded, but didn't look away. "I know. Believe me, I've spent weeks listing every reason this is a terrible idea. You're everything I'm supposed to oppose. Getting close to you could destroy my career, my credibility, everything I've worked for." Kenny felt his heart rate increase, an unfamiliar sensation of hope and fear mixing. "But?" Carter smiled, the expression soft and scared and determined. "But you pulled me out of a burning car when you should have walked away. You're protecting my sister when you could have refused. You keep your word when your world is built on lies, and when I'm here, I feel like I can breathe in ways I can't anywhere else." The confession hung between them, honest and dangerous, the kind of truth that changed everything. Kenny reached out slowly, giving her time to pull back, his hand finding hers on the railing. Her fingers curled around his, the touch electric and grounding simultaneously. "I'm not a good man, Carter. I've done things that would make you sick, made choices I can't take back." She squeezed his hand, her thumb brushing his knuckles. "I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking if there's space for this, for us, in all the complicated, impossible mess we're in." Kenny looked at their joined hands, at the physical representation of lines crossed and new territories claimed. He thought about the man he'd been, the man he was, the man he might become with someone like her seeing him clearly and choosing him anyway. "There's space," he said finally, the words feeling like stepping off a cliff and growing wings simultaneously. "But Carter, if we do this, It'll be the hardest thing either of us has ever done." She laughed, the sound carrying relief and reckless joy. "I pulled myself out of a crashed car with a gunshot wound. Hard is relative." Kenny smiled, real and unguarded, the expression feeling strange and right. "Then I guess we'd better figure it out." They stayed on that balcony long into the night, talking and not talking, building something neither had planned and both desperately needed, the city below them continuing its indifferent rotation, while above it two people rewrote their rules. Inside, Grace slept safely, the protection Kenny provided expanding to include the woman who'd stumbled into his path, covered in blood, and changed everything. The case broke 4 weeks later, Carter's persistence and Kenny's resources creating pressure from both sides until the guilty crumbled. Grace testified, her protection holding through the trial, her courage stronger than the fear they'd tried to instill. The conviction came down hard and final. Justice served through channels that didn't examine too closely how the witness had stayed safe. When it was over, Carter came to the safe house one last time, Grace beside her, both of them free in ways they hadn't been for months. Grace hugged Kenny, the gesture fierce and grateful. "Thank you for everything, for keeping me safe, for keeping her sane." She glanced at Carter, meaning obvious. Kenny returned the hug carefully. This young woman who'd taught him something about trust and lines. "Stay out of trouble. And Grace, keep that fighting spirit, it'll take you far." She grinned, mischief replacing fear. "I will. And don't worry, I won't tell anyone about your terrible poker face." Kenny laughed, the sound genuine. "My reputation thanks you." Carter walked Grace down to the waiting car, a proper protection detail now, official and clean. When she returned, it was just her and Kenny in the space that had housed an unlikely alliance. The silence felt full of endings and beginnings. "So," Carter said, her hands in her pockets, her posture vulnerable. "Grace is safe. The case is closed. The official reason for all this is done." Kenny nodded, understanding what she wasn't saying. "And the unofficial reasons?" Carter crossed the space between them, her steps deliberate, her eyes holding his. "Those are just getting started." She kissed him, the contact breaking through months of careful distance and denied attraction, the physical expression of everything they'd built and risked. Kenny kissed back, his hands finding her waist, pulling her closer, the moment erasing boundaries and creating new definitions. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Carter rested her forehead against his chest. "This is crazy." Kenny held her, his voice rumbling against her ear. "Probably, but it's our kind of crazy." The relationship that followed existed in careful shadows, a partnership built on trust and maintained through caution. They navigated it like the minefield it was, stolen moments and careful compartmentalization, keeping their worlds separate while letting themselves bleed together in private spaces. Carter's colleagues didn't know, couldn't know, the cost of revelation too high for her career. Kenny's people knew but said nothing, loyalty buying silence and acceptance. They built routines around the secrecy, meeting at neutral locations, the safe house becoming their retreat. Conversations flowing from case law to philosophy, from past traumas to future possibilities. Kenny found himself caring about things he'd long stopped considering. Carter's cases becoming personal, her safety a priority that superseded business. Carter found herself understanding gray areas she'd previously seen in black and white, justice becoming more complex when viewed through Kenny's eyes. They challenged each other, pushed boundaries, argued about methods and means and the space between right and wrong. But underneath the arguments lived something solid, respect and attraction, and the kind of connection that survived disagreement. Grace became their biggest supporter and most persistent worry, knowing the truth and keeping it with the fierce loyalty of someone who understood debt. She'd visit sometimes, dinners that felt like family, the three of them navigating relationships that defied easy category. Kenny watched Carter with her sister, saw the protective love that drove every choice, understood why she'd risked everything to keep Grace safe. Carter watched Kenny with Grace, saw the gentleness he showed, the patience that contradicted everything his reputation. Ken promised, understood that people contained multitudes that reputations couldn't capture. 6 months in, Kenny faced a choice that tested everything they'd built. A deal went wrong. Violence threatened to spiral, the kind of situation that required response, or invited worse. He could handle it his way, the methods that had kept him alive and in power. But Carter would know, would see the aftermath in police reports and morgue photos. Or he could try something different, use leverage and negotiation, risk weakness for the chance of clean hands. He sat in his office long into the night, the choice weighing on him with unfamiliar pressure. Carter found him there, letting herself in with the key he'd given her 3 weeks prior, the gesture meaning more than security. She didn't ask permission, just sat across from him, reading his tension like a language she'd learned. "Talk to me," she said, the invitation simple. Kenny told her, laying out the situation without softening edges or hiding realities. When he finished, he waited for judgment, for the cop in her to override the woman, for the line they'd been dancing around to finally break. Carter was quiet, her fingers drumming that nervous tell on the desk. Then she leaned forward, her eyes serious. "What do you want to do? Not what you think you should do. Not what your reputation demands. What does the man I know want?" Kenny felt something crack open in his chest, the question reaching places he'd locked down years ago. "I want to find a way that doesn't add to the body count. I want to be someone you don't have to forgive." Carter reached across the desk, taking his hand, her touch warm and steady. "Then find that way. I know it's harder. I know it might cost you respect or power or whatever currency your world trades in. But Kenny, you're already not the man your reputation says you are. Maybe it's time to stop pretending you have to be." The words settled over him like permission he'd been waiting for without knowing he needed it. Kenny made calls, restructured the deal, used information and leverage instead of violence, found the path that required more intelligence and left fewer corpses. It cost him. Whispers starting about softness, about weakness, about the boss who'd lost his edge. Marcus came to him worried. Reports of subordinates testing boundaries, seeing if the rumors meant opportunity. Kenny handled it with strategic precision, demonstrating that choosing different methods didn't mean having no teeth. That intelligence was its own kind of strength. Carter watched the fallout, her concern visible, her support constant. "Are you okay?" she asked one night, after a particularly difficult negotiation that had threatened to collapse into old patterns. Kenny pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, grounding himself in her presence. "I'm figuring it out. It's not easy, rewriting rules I've lived by for 20 years. She pulled back to look at him, her hands framing his face. "Nothing worth doing is easy. But you're doing it. That matters." The shift in Kenny's operations was gradual but real. Less violence, more negotiation, the kind of change that rippled outward in ways he couldn't always control. Some of his people adapted, seeing the long game, understanding that attention from law enforcement decreased when body counts dropped. Others left, seeking bosses who maintained old traditions, the cycle of violence they understood. Kenny let them go, the pruning painful but necessary. Carter's captain noticed the changes too, homicide rates dropping in territories Kenny controlled. The suspicious timing raising questions Carter deflected with careful truth. "Things change," she told her captain, not mentioning her role in the catalyst. "Maybe someone's getting smart." The captain studied her, that cop instinct pinging on things unsaid. But he let it go, results mattering more than methods he couldn't prove. Meanwhile, Kenny and Carter's relationship deepened in ways that surprised them both, the stolen moments accumulating into something that felt like foundation. They talked about futures in careful hypotheticals, neither willing to jinx it with concrete plans but both imagining possibilities. Carter told him about the cases that kept her up at night, the victims she couldn't save, the justice that came too late or not at all. Kenny told her about the empire he'd built and the cage it had become, the choices that had seemed necessary that now felt like chains. One evening, Carter arrived at the safe house with a file folder, her expression complicated. Kenny looked up from the dinner he was cooking, domestic skills emerging from years of living alone above restaurants. "What's that?" Carter set the folder on the counter, her hand resting on it like she was holding something dangerous. "An opportunity. And a test." Kenny wiped his hands, giving her his full attention. Carter opened the folder, revealing surveillance photos and case notes. "There's a trafficking ring operating in your territory. Human trafficking. Young women, most of them undocumented, scared to go to police. We've been trying to build a case for months, but they're smart, careful, and our usual tactics aren't working." Kenny studied the photos, his jaw tightening, the old anger rising for a cause he could support. "You want me to help?" Carter met his eyes, the question heavy between them. "I want to know if you'll help. This isn't about us. Not directly. This is about whether you mean what you've been showing me, whether the change is real or just performance." Kenny felt the weight of it, the test of character and intention, the moment where words had to become action or lose all meaning. He looked at the photos again, at faces of women who'd been made invisible by circumstance and cruelty, the kind of invisible he'd been trained to ignore. "Tell me what you need," he said, the decision made before he'd consciously chosen, the man Carter saw in him demanding to be real. What followed was a careful collaboration, Carter feeding Kenny information through channels that couldn't be traced, Kenny using his networks to map the trafficking operations structure and vulnerabilities. They worked late into nights, the dining table covered with notes and photos, building the case from both sides of the law simultaneously. Kenny's contacts provided information cops couldn't access, street-level intelligence about locations and schedules, and the men who profited from suffering. Carter's resources provided legal framework, ensuring whatever they built would hold in court, that rescue wouldn't just scatter the operation, but destroy it. The actual operation went down on a cold Tuesday, coordinated between Carter's unit and Kenny's people in ways that looked coincidental. Police raids hitting locations Kenny's intelligence had mapped. Timing perfect because two worlds had synchronized. 17 women rescued, 8 arrests made, the operation dismantled completely. Carter's captain praised her work, the investigation he thought she'd been running alone, unaware of the criminal assistance that had made it possible. Kenny watched the news coverage from his office, Marcus beside him, both understanding the significance beyond the immediate. "That's new territory," Marcus observed carefully. Kenny nodded, his attention on the screen showing rescued women being led to safety, to resources, to futures they'd been denied. "It's the right territory." Marcus was quiet, then spoke with the weight of long loyalty. "Some of the guys are talking about the changes, about whether you're still the man they signed up with." Kenny turned from the screen, meeting Marcus's eyes. "What do you think?" Marcus considered, his face showing the thinking of a man who'd survived by reading power dynamics and betting correctly. "I think you're becoming someone different, not weaker, just pointed different. Some of them won't adapt, won't see that there's power in what you're building." Kenny waited, sensing more. Marcus smiled slightly. "But I think the ones worth keeping will figure it out. And I think whatever you're building with that cop, it's making you better at the job, not worse. Different." but better. The vote of confidence steadied something in Kenny, the approval of a man whose judgment he trusted. That night, Carter came over with Thai food and exhausted triumph. The trafficking case closed, 17 lives saved, her faith in Kenny's transformation validated in concrete terms. They ate sitting on the floor, containers spread between them, her head eventually finding his shoulder. "Thank you," she said quietly, the words encompassing more than one case. "For being who I believed you could be." Kenny kissed the top of her head, breathing in the reality of her, the woman who'd seen his worst potential and demanded his best instead. "Thank you for believing it in the first place." They stayed like that, the city, humming beyond the windows, two people from opposite sides of every line that mattered, building something neither had planned and both desperately needed. The path forward wasn't clear, wouldn't ever be simple, the complications of their positions ensuring constant navigation. But sitting there, Carter safe against his side, the taste of righteousness unfamiliar and addictive, Kenny felt something he'd stopped allowing himself years ago. Hope. Not the naive kind that ignored reality, but the earned kind that came from choosing better and seeing it work, from becoming someone different and finding it fit better than the old skin. Carter fell asleep against him, her breathing evening out, trust implicit in the vulnerability. Kenny stayed awake longer, watching her, protecting her rest the way she'd protected something in him he'd thought long dead. The following months tested them in new ways, the balancing act of their relationship requiring constant adjustment. Carter got promoted, her captain recognizing her string of successful cases, the trafficking bust opening doors. With promotion came scrutiny, internal affairs taking renewed interest in her methods, her associates, her unusually effective intelligence gathering. She navigated it with the skill that had made her good at her job, answering questions without lying but without revealing, maintaining boundaries that protected them both. Kenny dealt with his own challenges, restructuring his operations around less violent models, losing people who couldn't adapt, gaining others who appreciated the reduced heat. Money still flowed, power still held, but the mechanisms shifted, becoming more sophisticated and less bloody. Not clean, never clean, but cleaner. Grace graduated college, her ceremony attended by Carter in uniform and Kenny in expensive civilian clothes. The three of them celebrating afterward like the unconventional family they'd become. Grace had job offers, real ones, her testimony and survival, giving her a story that spoke to resilience. She chose prosecution, following her sister's path from a different angle. Justice through courts instead of streets. "You inspired this," she told Kenny at dinner, her eyes serious. "Watching you choose to be better. It made me want to be part of making things better too." Kenny felt the weight of influence, of being seen and having that sight matter, of choices rippling beyond their immediate splash. "Just promise me you'll be careful. The system breaks people who care too much." Grace smiled, fierce and determined. "Then I'll have to care the right amount and fight the right way." Carter watched the exchange with emotion playing across her face. Her two favorite people understanding each other, her worlds overlapping with less friction than she'd feared. Later, walking back to Kenny's car, Carter slipped her hand into his, the gesture public in a way they usually avoided. "I love you," she said, the words simple and enormous, the first time either had spoken them despite months of showing them. Kenny stopped walking, turning to face her under a streetlight, the city moving around them in indifferent traffic. "Say that again." Carter smiled, no hesitation, no doubt. "I love you. I love who you are, who you're becoming, who you are when you're with me and when you're not. I love the choices you make even when they cost you. I love your terrible poker face and your good cooking and the way you listen to Grace like her opinions matter." Kenny felt his throat tight, emotion overwhelming practiced control. I love you too. I love your stubbornness and your faith, and the way you see good in places everyone else has written off. I love that you make me want to be better and believe I can be. They kissed there on the street, not caring who saw, the moment marking a shift from hidden to owned, from secret to acknowledged. It was a risk, a statement, a choice that said what they'd built mattered more than the complications it created. Walking back to the car, hands still joined, Kenny knew they'd crossed another line, that public acknowledgement meant increased danger, that their enemies would see weakness where they saw strength. But holding Carter's hand, feeling the certainty of her beside him, he decided some risks were worth taking, that living fully mattered more than living safely. The threats came, as Kenny had known they would, whispers and probes from rivals who saw his relationship with a cop as vulnerability. Carter faced her own pressure, anonymous tips sent to internal affairs about her associations, questions about how she'd gotten information for recent busts. They weathered it together, careful and strategic. Carter documenting everything to protect against false accusations, Kenny using his network to identify and neutralize threats before they materialized. It was exhausting, the constant vigilance, but it was also clarifying, the opposition proving what mattered and what didn't. During a difficult week, Carter showed up at Kenny's office, face tight with fury. Internal Affairs opened an investigation. Someone sent them photos of us together. They're building a case that I'm compromised. Kenny felt ice in his gut. I can make the photos disappear, discredit the source. Carter shook her head. No, we don't fight this by hiding. I'm going to tell them the truth. That you saved my life, helped protect Grace, that we've developed a relationship. My cases are clean, my methods legal, and who I date is my business. Kenny felt real fear. Carter, that's suicide for your career. She smiled sadly. Maybe, or maybe I set the precedent that cops are allowed to be humans. Either way, I'm not hiding anymore. The hearing was brutal. Carter answered every question with unflinching honesty, admitting the relationship, defending her methods, presenting evidence her cases were built on legal work. Grace testified how Kenny's protection had made justice possible. The board deliberated. For 3 hours. Their decision was narrow. Conditional retention with quarterly reviews. Not victory, but survival. Carter emerged exhausted but intact, her badge still hers. Kenny was waiting. At the safe house, she collapsed on the couch. I thought they'd take my badge. Kenny pulled her close. You were incredible. I realized I was done being ashamed. You saved my life. You helped save Grace. Why should I apologize for that? What happens now? Now we live. Carefully, but honestly. The months that followed were lighter. Carter's colleagues knew now. Most kept distance. Some showed support. A few were hostile. Kenny continued transforming his empire into something more legitimate. Grace became an assistant prosecutor. Sunday dinners became tradition, the three of them plus Marcus, who'd become family. After a year of flawless reviews, restrictions on Carter's cases lifted. They talked about the future, decided to move in together. They chose a new loft with windows overlooking the city. Carter's books about law shared shelves with Kenny's volumes on strategy. Her uniform hung beside his suits. Her badge found a drawer next to where he kept backup weapons. Grace helped them move. You two are proof that life doesn't care about clean categories. You're both good people who took different paths to get there. That night, their first in the new place, they stood on the balcony watching the city. Do you ever wonder if we're crazy? Carter asked. Trying to make this work when every logical reason says it shouldn't? Kenny wrapped his arms around her. Every day. But then I think about the alternative. Walking away from you, from who I'm becoming. And that seems crazier. Carter covered his hands with hers. I'm not naive anymore. I know what you are, what you've done, but you're also the man who risked everything to save a stranger, who protected my sister, who's trying every day to be better. That's who I choose. I don't deserve you, he said quietly, but I'm selfish enough to keep trying to earn you anyway. They stood there, the city sprawling beneath them, two people who'd found each other in the worst circumstances and built something beautiful from wreckage. Inside, boxes waited to be unpacked, lives to be merged, futures to be built. But on that balcony, they existed outside the endless dance of crime and justice, creating their own rhythm, proving that sometimes salvation came from unexpected places and second chances were real. The night deepened, and they went inside together, closing the door on the past and opening another on whatever came next, ready to face it side by side, the cop and the criminal who'd saved each other and kept choosing to stay saved.